You ever notice how some months feel like you're just surviving on autopilot? Like you check your bank account more often than you'd like to admit. Not because you enjoy it, but because you're kind of bracing yourself for bad news. Rent, groceries, that unexpected bill that shows up like it has personal beef with you specifically. And then there are those rare moments, you know the ones, where for a few seconds you feel okay. Not rich, not anything dramatic. Just okay. Like you can breathe without calculating the cost of every breath. It's weird how money can shape your entire emotional state like that. Not just your choices, but your actual mood, your patience, even how you look at the future. And honestly, I've spent way too much time thinking about this stuff. Money, behavior, why people stay stuck in certain financial loops even when they're working hard. My name is Tim, and I kind of fell into this habit of observing how money quietly changes. People long before they even realize they've leveled up or stayed stuck. Because here's the thing I keep noticing. Most people think wealth is just a number. Like, you hit a certain bank balance and suddenly life upgrades itself like a video game. But it doesn't really work like that. What actually happens is more subtle, almost invisible while you're in it. Your life doesn't change in one big moment. It shifts in stages. Quiet ones. Psychological ones. The kind you only notice when you look back and think, wait, I used to stress about that? And once you see these stages clearly, something interesting happens. You stop thinking about money as just income or expenses. You start seeing it as levels of freedom, levels of pressure, levels of mental space. So in this video, or I guess in this conversation we're about to have, I want to walk you through something simple but kind of eye-opening. The 3 net worth levels where life actually starts feeling different, and not just financially different. I mean emotionally, socially, even how you carry yourself when you walk into a room, and maybe as we go through it, you'll start recognizing where you are without anyone needing to tell you. All right, let's get into it. There's a certain kind of life where money is always loud, not literally loud, obviously, but mentally. It's always there in the background like static noise you can't turn off. This is the survival stage, and if you've ever lived it, you don't need me to explain it too deeply because your body remembers it more than your mind does. At this level, money doesn't feel like a tool. It feels like weather, unpredictable, sometimes calm, mostly not. You check your bank account not out of curiosity but out of caution, like you're checking if the storm passed yet. And the strange thing is, people in this stage are usually working incredibly hard. That's the part outsiders don't always see. It's not laziness. It's not lack of effort. It's just the math isn't giving enough breathing room yet, so life becomes this cycle. Work, get paid, bills, stress, repeat. And you start developing these tiny mental habits without noticing, like always mentally subtracting expenses before you even agree to anything. Even small things. A meal out, a taxi, a new shirt. Everything has a hidden second price in your mind, and emotionally, it creates this constant low-level tension, not panic, not always, but a kind of background stress that never fully leaves. You might be relaxing on the outside, but inside there's always a part of you slightly scanning for problems. What if something breaks? What if I need money unexpectedly? What if next month is worse? It's like living with a phone that never stops vibrating, even when nothing is actually happening. And here's something interesting. At this stage, time feels heavier than money, because every hour is tied to income. If you don't work, you don't earn. If you don't earn, things get tight. So even rest can feel a little guilty. And I know that sounds extreme, but it's surprisingly common. Now socially, something else happens here too. You might not notice it at first, but your decisions start shrinking your world. You say no more often. You skip things. You stay quiet in conversations about travel, investments, or opportunities because those topics feel slightly distant. Not because you're incapable, but because your mental bandwidth is already full. And over time, this creates a subtle identity. I'm just trying to get by. That becomes the internal narrative. But here's the important part. This stage feels permanent while you're in it. Like it's just how life is, but it isn't. It's a phase defined by lack of margin. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of effort. Margin. Because the real difference between this stage and the next one isn't suddenly making huge amounts of money. It's when the gaps start appearing. Gaps between income and expenses. Gaps between stress and survival. Gaps between reaction and planning. And when those gaps appear, life starts shifting, slowly at first. This is where things start to soften. Not dramatically. Not like a movie scene where everything suddenly changes. More like you wake up one day and realize you didn't check your bank account in a panic this morning. At this stage, basic survival is handled. Bills are mostly covered. Emergencies are still stressful, but not catastrophic. There's usually some savings, even if it's not huge. And emotionally, that changes everything. Because for the first time, your life isn't constantly reacting. There's a small buffer now, and that buffer, small as it might be, is everything. You start noticing things like, you can plan a little ahead. You can say yes without overthinking every detail. You can breathe between expenses. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though life feels better, freedom still isn't fully there. Because stability is not the same as independence. You're still aware of money. Still cautious. Still making decisions with a subtle layer of don't mess this up in the background. It's like driving a car that finally has brakes that work. But you're still nervous about every turn. And socially. This stage is fascinating because you start to move differently in conversations. You're not struggling like before. So you relate more easily to people talking about growth, goals, improvement, but at the same time, you're still very aware of limits. So you exist in this middle space. Comfortable enough not to panic, but not free enough to relax fully. And honestly, this is where a lot of people stay for a long time. Because stability feels safe. Even if it's not fully satisfying, there's a psychological comfort in, I'm okay. Even if okay isn't exciting. But the hidden trap here is stagnation. Because when life stops being painful, urgency disappears. And without urgency, growth slows down. Not always, but often. And I think that's why this stage is so important to recognize, because it can quietly become a long-term holding pattern. But it doesn't have to. Because the same structure that created stability can also create expansion. It just requires a shift from protection to growth, from don't lose what I have to build what I don't yet have. And that shift is what leads to the next level. This is where everything changes, but not in the way people expect, because freedom doesn't feel loud, it feels quiet. At this stage, money stops being the central decision maker in your daily life. Not because it disappears, but because it stops being the main filter for every choice. You don't wake up thinking about survival. You don't constantly calculate risk for basic things. Instead, something subtle shifts. You start thinking in terms of time, energy, value, not just cost. And that changes your entire relationship with life. A simple example. In earlier stages, you ask, can I afford this? Here the question becomes, is this worth my time? That shift sounds small, but it's massive, because it means your decision-making center has moved from fear to choice. And when choice becomes your default, life feels completely different. You start noticing things like, you're less reactive in conversations. You're less emotionally tied to small financial fluctuations. You're more patient, not because life is easier, but because pressure is lower. And socially, people treat you differently too, even if nothing about you visibly changed. There's a calmness that shows up in how you speak, how you decide, how you move. But here's something important I've noticed. People think this stage is about luxury. It's not. Luxury is just a side effect. The real change is psychological space. Space to think. Space to choose. Space to not be constantly solving problems. And that space is rare, because most people never experience life without financial background noise. So when that noise quiets down, even slightly, everything feels different, not perfect, just lighter, and maybe that's the real definition of wealth that doesn't get talked about enough. Not showing off, not accumulation, but reduction of unnecessary pressure. When you look at these three levels together, something becomes very clear. Life doesn't change because you suddenly become a different person. It changes because the pressure around you changes. In the first stage, life is about survival. Everything feels urgent. Every decision carries weight. In the second stage, life stabilizes. You get space to breathe, but still operate within limits. And in the third stage, life opens up. Not because problems disappear, but because they stop dominating every decision. And the interesting part is this. Most people think the goal is just more money, but what they're really chasing, whether they realize it or not, is less stress. More control. More breathing room. More life that feels like it belongs to them. And once you see it like that, the entire idea of wealth shifts. It stops being a number you're chasing blindly and starts becoming a direction you're moving toward with awareness. Because the truth is, you don't suddenly arrive at freedom. You grow into it, one decision at a time, one gap at a time, one shift at a time. And maybe right now, you're somewhere in these levels. Maybe between them. Maybe transitioning without even noticing yet. But once you understand the structure, you don't unsee it. And that's the real shift. Not just knowing where you are, but understanding where you're going. And why it finally starts to feel different when you get there.